Taxi drivers of Reddit, what's the strangest thing you've overheard? NYC taxi driver here. I recently had some guys talking about a brilliant idea. They had to pay a bunch of homeless people on bikes to generate electricity for their Bitcoin computer while they fed them something cheap like egg rolls. My best taxi-related story. One time in college, one of my friends was blackout drunk, roaming around the bars at our school when he decided he'd had enough and he started looking for a cab back to his dorm. However, instead of a cab, he climbed into the back of a cop car and proceeded to try to direct the cop to his dorm. The cop, being a nice guy, actually took him and eventually passed the kid off to his roommate. I actually asked a taxi driver a couple months back what the weirdest thing that ever happened in his taxi, and he said there was two elderly women in the backseat and they were talking quite loud about normal stuff. Then all of a sudden they both went quiet and there was a bad smell in the car. The taxi driver said he didn't want to say anything, but he heard one woman mention quietly to the other it happened. The other replied, "What happened?" And the whispered quietly, "I've pooped myself." He said they didn't say much else the rest of the trip, then got out at a house and tipped him 100% of the fare. Not an actual taxi driver, but I often give lifts to friends to save them money on a taxi. One time I picked up my mate and a girl he'd pulled. Normally you don't overhear anything of interest, just drunk nonsense. However, this time I couldn't hear anything. I look in the rearview mirror and she's giving him a blowjob. I almost said something, but instead I obliged the bro code and let it happen, in the back of my car. We laughed about it the next day and he was pretty sorry. Okay, so I'm not a taxi driver, but my dad is, and this isn't so much about what was overheard as opposed to what was witnessed. Anyway, my dad picked up a couple of Aboriginal transvestites. It's not shocking when you live in Queensland, Australia. The trip was relatively uneventful and eventually they arrived at their destination. So my dad asked them for the money and the lady boy reached into his/her underwear and pulled out a $50 dollar note that was dripping from an unknown substance. My dad said not to worry about the money because he was on the verge of throwing up. Taught me a valuable lesson about washing my hands after handling money. I drove for a black car service for about 2 years. Since I was fairly clean-cut and reliable, they started giving me Board of Education jobs, basically driving problem children and their parents to what I affectionately referred to as prison schools. These were isolated schools, usually out in the country with higher security to accommodate students with behavioral, emotional, or mental problems. Anyway, I had to take a mom and her kid from the Bronx to Pennsylvania. The kid, I think he was 17, had severe emotional disturbance and developmental issues as well and did not want to go back to his school. The entire trip he was begging her not to send him back, while she tried to calm him down. Anyway, midway through Jersey I hear a lot of action in backseat and she asks me to pull over. It turns out her son had hidden away a kitchen knife in his bag and was trying to stab either his mom or himself in order to avoid going back. She wrestled the knife away from him in a fast food parking lot and we turned around and headed back to the Bronx. TL, Dr. Disturbed kid tried to stab his mom.